Welcome back to Lady Mythos. You're still awake. That's all right. You're safe here. You've found your way back. Here, we don't rush. We don't demand. We simply listen and drift. To the old stories, the ones the world carried for centuries. Stories that lived in firelit halls. Stories carved into stone or hidden in poetry, half forgotten, half remembered. Stories whispered by winds that move over mountains and seas. And tonight, we go north, to the old Norse world. A world of long winters and sudden summers. A world of roaring seas, of forests so deep they never seemed to end, of stars that wheeled slowly over dark nights. A world where people gathered around the hearth and listened, just as you're listening now, to the sagas of gods and giants, of fate and prophecy, of love and betrayal. But tonight, we are not with Odin, the one-eyed seeker, nor with Thor, who shakes the sky with thunder, nor even with Loki, the sly, the restless, the firebringer. Tonight, I want to tell you of another, a gentler god, a shining one. He was loved by all, by gods, by mortals, by every creature of the 9 realms. He was peace in a world of war, the promise of spring after winter, the soft light after the storm. And yet, even he could not escape fate. This is the story of Baldur, the shining god. So, settle in. Let your eyes grow heavy. And let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shining God. They say Baldur was unlike all the others. Thor carried his hammer, Mjolnir, that split mountains and sent giants crashing into the sea. Odin had his spear, Gungnir, and wisdom so deep it frightened even the gods. Tyr carried courage in his single hand, Freya her beauty and her magic, Loki his sharp tongue and sly fire. But Baldur carried something different. He carried peace. When Baldur entered the hall of Gladsheim, the noise softened. Voices dropped, arguments cooled, and the fire itself seemed to burn gentler. The gold of the pillars caught his glow, and the silver shield hanging above the high seat reflected his light. Even the great wolves carved into the walls looked calmer when Baldur walked past. He wasn't just handsome, though people spoke of his fairness often enough. His skin was pale as the first snow, his hair bright as wheat fields ripening under summer sun. His eyes shone, not with sharpness, but with warmth. To look at him was to believe that all things, even the bitterest winters, even the longest nights, would one day soften and pass. In Midgard, the mortals prayed to him not for victory in battle, but for rest, for dreams without fear, for safe births, for calm waters, for peace between kin. Children whispered his name before closing their eyes, hoping the shining god would keep their sleep free of shadows. The other gods adored him. His wife, Nanna, watched him as though he carried her heart in his hands. Even Odin, grim and far-seeing, softened when Baldur stood at his side. For Baldur was light in a world that knew too much darkness. And so he was loved. By gods, by men, by every creature of the 9 realms. But even light can cast a shadow. One night, as the fires in the hall burned low and silence wrapped Asgard in its arms, Baldur dreamed. At first, it was only a flicker. A path of stone, the sky without stars. A chill so deep it seemed to crawl into his bones. He woke, uneasy, the memory already fading like mist. The next night, the dream came again, this time darker. He stood in a field where nothing grew, where the earth was cracked and lifeless. Shapes moved in the distance, tall, thin, silent. They were not men, though they wore the outlines of men. They turned their hollow eyes upon him, and his heart stuttered. He woke with a cry, Nanna's hand on his chest, her voice soft, asking what he had seen. But Baldur only shook his head. The third night, the dream grew heavier. He saw his own body, pale and still, lying on a bier of stone. Around him, the gods stood weeping. Odin's head was bowed. Frigg's face was buried in her hands. Thor clenched his hammer, but did not strike. The sound of their grief rose around him like the crashing of waves. He woke trembling, his face damp with sweat, his breath caught in his throat. Night after night, the visions returned. Sometimes he was pierced by unseen weapons. Sometimes he was crushed beneath shadows. Sometimes he lay beneath the earth, listening as stones wept for him. But always, always the dream ended in silence, in the stillness of death. And each morning he rose, paler, quieter. The light within him dimmed just a little more. The shining god was haunted. And all of Asgard began to feel it. Chapter 2. Dreams of Darkness. The dreams did not leave him. Night after night they returned, circling him like wolves in the snow. Baldur, the Shining One, the god who brought peace, who carried light into every hall, now lay awake in fear of his own sleep. And when he closed his eyes, the visions came. The first vision, the shore of silence. He found himself standing on a shoreline he had never seen before. The sea was black, not blue, not grey, but truly black, as if it held no light at all. The waves rose and fell without sound. Not a gull cried, not a wind stirred. The sand beneath his feet was cold, sharp, cutting at his skin. When he looked behind him, there was no hall, no hearth, no sun rising, only emptiness. Ahead, on the dark water, a ship drifted. Its sail hung torn. its deck empty. And yet, Baldr felt the weight of eyes upon him, as though unseen figures crowded the vessel, watching silently. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. He tried to step into the sea, but the water froze around his ankles, holding him still. And then he saw himself lying upon the deck of that ship, pale, motionless, his body wrapped in cloth, his hands crossed over his chest. The dream broke like ice beneath him, and he woke with a cry. Nanna stirred at his side, reaching for him. But Baldr only shook his head, pressing his face into the pillow, ashamed of the terror in his heart. The second vision, the field of ashes. Another night, another dream. This time he stood in a field. At first, it seemed ordinary. Open, wide. The kind of place where cattle might graze. But when he knelt to touch the ground, the grass crumbled to ash beneath his fingers. The air smelled of smoke, though no fire burned. In the distance, figures stood. They were tall, thin, still. From far away they looked like men, but their skin was grey, their eyes hollow. They did not move. They only stared at him, as though waiting. Baldr walked forward, each step stirring a faint whisper of ash. When he reached out to touch one of the figures, it dissolved in his hand, scattering like dust in the wind. And then he looked down and saw his own body lying on the ground before him, not moving, not breathing. Ash settling gently across his face. Baldr fell to his knees, but his knees sank into emptiness, into nothingness. And he woke, gasping. The third vision, the stone bier. This dream was the worst. He lay upon a bier of stone, cold, seeped into his back, into his bones. Above him stretched the roof of Gladsheim's hall, but it was dim. The golden pillars that once shone brightly were dull and grey. Around him, the gods stood in silence. Thor's shoulders shook, though no thunder came. Odin's one eye was shadowed, his head bowed. Frigg covered her face with her hands, her sobs breaking the still air. Even Loki stood apart, silent, his eyes unreadable. The weeping of the gods filled the hall, louder than storms, louder than rivers in flood. But Baldr could not move, could not speak, could not rise. He tried to draw breath, and none came. He tried to lift his hand, and it lay still upon his chest. And he knew he was dead. The fourth vision, the bridge of the dead. On another night, the dream shifted. He walked a long road beneath a dark sky. The stars above him were faint, like dying embers. Ahead, a bridge arched over a wide river. The water beneath was icy blue, running fast, filled with whispers that rose like mist. At the bridge stood a woman. She was tall cloaked, her eyes deep as shadows. She did not move as Baldur approached. When he stepped upon the bridge, the woman spoke, though her lips did not move. Not yet, but soon. Her voice was cold as stone, heavy as the earth itself. Baldur tried to turn, to run back the way he had come, but behind him the road was gone. Only darkness stretched there. And when he looked again, the woman had vanished. He woke with a shudder so strong that the bed shook beneath him. Each night, the visions grew darker. Each night, they took more from him. His laughter, his ease, the glow that once filled the hall. Nenna watched him with worry, her hand reaching for his, her eyes pleading for him to speak. The other gods began to whisper. They saw how the shining god grew pale, how his light dimmed. And in Asgard, unease spread like frost across glass. For the gods knew, dreams were not idle. Dreams were omens. And when death walked in a god's dreams, it was not to be ignored. Chapter 3. The Plea of Frigg. There's a moment when worry becomes decision. Frigg felt it like a click inside her chest. Quiet, firm, final. The dreams were not going to stop. Baldur's light was dimming, and the halls of Asgard had learned to hold their breath. The laughter that used to roll off the benches at night now landed softly and ended early. Even Thor, who could make a feast roar just by sitting down, had fallen quieter. Odin watched from the high seat, his one eye distant, as if tracking threads of fate only he could see. Frigg stood, smoothed the front of her dress, and said simply, "I'm going." No one asked where. They all knew. In the old belief, an oath is not a word. It's a binding. A promise that tethers the speaker to the thing spoken, as sure as a chain. Frigg's plan was ancient, older than the youngest mountains. If every being in the 9 realms swore not to harm Baldur, not by tooth or claw, not by iron or stone, not by fire or frost, then even fate would find no hand to work through. So she set out. No trumpets, no ceremony. Just a mother, cloak pinned at the shoulder, walking into the world to speak to everything it held. She began in the hall itself. Frigg called the Aesir and the Vanir together, gods of war and of fields, of hearth and horizon. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. People quieted because it was Frigg, and because when she spoke, things tended to stay the way she wanted them to. "Swear it," she said softly, looking from face to face. "Swear you will not harm Baldur, not by hand or by word, not by weapon, not by trick." Thor slapped his chest with his palm. "By my hammer and by the thunder, I swear." Sif, golden-haired, touched Frigg's arm. "I swear." Bragi, whose words were music, swore. Heimdall, watcher of the Bifrost, swore with the steadiness of a dawn that never forgets to arrive. Freya and Freya, sun warm and star bright, swore, Tyr, with the weight of honor in his one hand, swore, his voice like an iron bell. Even Loki, leaning back in shadow, eyes glinting, lifted 2 fingers in a lazy gesture. "I swear," he said, and smiled without showing teeth. Frigg nodded once. "Good. But halls are only halls. Walls listen well, yet it is the world that holds the dangers." She would have to go further. She went first to the places that had no shape but carried power in every form. Fire and water. In Muspelheim, where the air itself shimmers and the ground blooms with heat, Frigg stood at the edge of a river of flame. Sparks lifted and whispered like tiny birds. She raised her hand. "Fire," she said, clear but gentle. "I ask for your word." Fire is proud, and it is old. It hissed and leaned toward her, curious, respectful. It knows queens when it sees them. "We do not harm him," the flames seem to say, in a language that is not really words. Not by burning, not by smoke, not by hidden coal. The heat folded in on itself, dimmed a shade. A bow of sorts. Frigg felt the promise settle across the world like a thin, invisible veil. In Midgard, she knelt by a river in early melt. Water hurried past, eager, silver-backed. "Water," she murmured, fingers sinking into the cold. By stream and sea, by ice and mist. Swear you will not drown him, nor drag him, nor swallow him in flood. The surface brightened, a glint like a smile. The current touched her knuckles and then slid away. Promise given. She spoke to rain that hung low over fields. "Do not wash him from this earth." The rain agreed, pattering softer. She breathed into mist and addressed ice, the old lock on winter's door. Each gave its oath, and with each one, Frigg felt the world grow a fraction safer. Next, the metals. She went to the dwarves' forges, where anvils rang and sparks leapt. She stood in the doorway, while master smiths squinted up at her, soot-black brows lifting. "Iron," she said, though she was speaking to the ore as much as to the men. "Steel, bronze, all that bites and cuts. Promise me your edges will not drink Baldur's blood." Hammers paused mid-swing. From the depths of the rock, where ore sleeps before it is born into blade, Frigg felt the answer. "We will not." The dwarves bowed, not to flatter, but because it felt right. The oath travelled into rivets and nails and spearheads that hadn't yet been made. The way heat moves through metal the moment it is forged. She went out onto the bones of the earth, into quarries where stone showed its ribs. "Stone," she said, palm pressed to granite that remembered glaciers and the weight of ancient snows. "Do not crush him. Do not fall upon him, nor give way beneath his feet. Stone is patient. It does not hurry, It considered, the way mountains consider, slowly, thoroughly. Then, all at once, Frigg sensed a shift, like bedrock settling. The oath came through firm and cool. In the forests, she spoke to wood. Oaks and beeches, pines with their sharp green scent. Do not splinter into him. Do not break upon him. Hold your branches. Leaves trembled, 1,000 small nods, and a green hush fell, as if the forest had exhaled and decided, yes. She knelt in the shadow of a hill and put her hand to soil that was dark and crumbly and smelled like the start of spring. Earth, she said, do not open to swallow him. Hold him gently. The ground warmed under her fingers. Promise. She called to beasts. A red deer lifted its head from grazing, ears flicking. A fox watched from a thicket with clever eyes. Wolves, thin and wary, lingered at the edge of the tree line. Frigg met each gaze. Teeth, hold back. Claws, stay sheathed. The deer stamped once. The fox dipped its head. And the wolves, proud and wild, blinked and licked the winter from their noses. Oaths, all of them, given in the language animals use. A posture, a breath, a look that has the gravity of stone. She spoke to birds. Crows tilted their heads. Owls shifted on their branches, careful and solemn. Eagles traced slow circles high above. Do not strike him from the sky. Do not blind him. Do not peck him. Feathers rustled like a whisper over the whole world. Agreed. And then she crouched low and spoke to what crawls. Snakes in their cold hollows, adders under heather, worms turning the soil, beetles glossy and ancient, spiders with silken patience. No venom, she said quietly. No bite meant the hymn. There is an old shiver in a person when they know they are speaking to the small and the hidden, the things that survive winters and kings alike. Frigg felt it, and still she held their gaze, and they held hers. One by one, the little lives gave their word. Even poison shifted in its jar, softening. She went among healers and named the names of fever, wasting, sharp pain, breathlessness, blood that will not clot, aching that roams the body like a lost thing. She named them, and then asked them to pass by Baldur's door. Sickness is cunning, but it knows a queen, and it knows a bargain. It withdrew a step. She spoke to shadow, to fear. Not him, she said. When you come, Walk past. Find another path. Even fear has a code. It tipped its head and slipped away, sulking like a reprimanded dog. Frigg moved across the 9 realms not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as a mother carrying a lighted candle into dark rooms. In Alfheim, where the air was fine as lace and the light had a taste of fresh apples, the elves listened. No glamour to trick him, Frigg asked. No charm to lead him astray. They bowed with their hand over their hearts, the way they do, and the promise fluttered like white moths across the meadows in Svartalfheim, among caves that sweated minerals, and tunnels that ran like veins. Dark elves peered up from work tables scattered with jewels. No snare, she said. No trap that catches his foot. A master artisan rolled a ruby between finger and thumb, then set it down with care. "We promise," he said, voice like stone dust. It echoed, and the echo was agreement. In Jotunheim, the land of giants, jagged and cold, Frigg stood on a cliff and let the wind pull at her hair. Giants are not gentle, and yet they understand the weight of vows. She called to them with the respect owed to old powers. "Let him pass unharmed," she said. "Hold your stones. Keep your spears at rest. Whatever quarrels lie between you and Asgard, turn them from Baldur." From across the ridgelines came a rumble. Not anger, not quite acceptance either, but that deep acknowledgement mountains grant to other mountains. A giantess, hair like a storm cloud, stepped forward and said, "We will not be the hand." Frigg inclined her head. It was enough. In Niflheim, where the cold has a voice, she said to Frost, "Do not take his breath." The mist thinned, letting her through. In Helheim, she did not enter, not fully, not yet, but at the border she spoke to the plain where the dead walk. "He is not yours," she whispered, and the wind there, colourless and old, paused as if considering. Even the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, glimmered brighter as she passed, as if laying down a strip of safety across the sky. When Frigg returned to Asgard, the day felt clean, like after a snowfall. She gathered the oaths the way a weaver gathers threads before setting them on the loom. In the great hall, she stood and named them. Not to brag, but because saying vows aloud gives them shape. "Fire will not burn him," she said, and the hearth curled its flames inward as if in a nod. "Water will not drown him. Ice will not lock him in. Mist will not blind his steps. Iron, bronze, and steel have sworn their edges will not bite him. Stone will not crush him, nor give way beneath him. Wood will not splinter into him. Beasts, birds, and all that creeps will keep their teeth and stings from him. Sickness will pass him by. Fear will walk around his bed. The realms have given their word. A murmur moved through the gathered. Relief, wonder, something like applause but softer and more reverent. Thor grinned with wet eyes he pretended were not wet. Sif squeezed Nanna's hand until both their knuckles went pale. Odin did not smile, but the set of his mouth eased. His fingers stopped tapping a restless rhythm on the arm of the high seat. Baldur, dear Baldur, stood a little straighter, as if a weight had slipped from his shoulders. Light, the real kind, not the sort that boasts, moved through him again. He lifted his mother's hand and kissed it. "Thank you," he said. Just that. It was enough to make the hall breathe again. For a time. Because in these stories, the audience knows something the characters do not. The tiny gap in the wall. The loose thread at the edge of a perfect weave. Frigg had walked far. She had been thorough, she was always thorough. But when she sat alone later, in the quiet that comes after triumph, she caught herself trying to list, once more, everything she had named. Fire, water, iron, stone, wood, earth, and wind and winter breath. Beasts, birds, creeping things. Sickness, fear, shadow. Oaths from elves and dwarves, promises from giants, nods from rivers and the ocean's great heart. Her lips moved silently, counting without numbers. It was almost complete. As complete as anything can be in a world where fate exists. Almost. In the gardens beyond her window, under the eaves where the late sun turned everything the color of warm honey, a small green thing had climbed a trunk and hung down like a ribbon. A plant most people ignored, unless they were thinking of winter feasts and stolen kisses. Mistletoe. It had seemed too young to fear, too soft to name. A thing that grew without root in the earth, joining branch to branch, but belonging wholly to neither. Not metal, not stone, not beast or bird. Barely wood, if we're being precise with the old categories. So small, so harmless. Frigg's brow furrowed, but only a little. She was tired. And the day had been long, and Baldur had smiled again. And the gods had laughed, without watching the door for bad news. She let the worry pass, because who could imagine harm from something so slight? The next day, with the oaths bright and new like fresh paint, the gods spilled into the courtyard beyond the hall. There was a mood around them. Not reckless, exactly, but light. The kind of relief that makes people try things. Someone, no one could later remember who, said, "Let's try." And so they did. They threw stones at Baldur. They bounced off like dried clay against a drum. They swung at him with axes and blades, and the iron turned aside as gently as a friendly hand. They lit the tip of a spear, and the fire there sighed and dwindled before it got close enough to singe a hair on his head. Each test prompted laughter, amazed and a little giddy. Baldur smiled, not proud, just relieved. Like a man waking from a bad week of weather into a patch of sun. Frigg watched from the steps, a small smile in her eyes, a hand wrapped around the railing as if to steady joy itself. Oaths were working. The world, for once, was doing what a mother asked. From the shadow of a pillar, a figure watched with an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Loki's looks were never the point. It was always the angle of his attention that mattered. Today, it sharpened, leaned, narrowed to a question that glinted like a knife. He did not interrupt the games. He did not need to. A thought had presented itself, as soft and small as a seed caught in someone's cloak. And Loki, who has never been able to leave a thought alone, was already turning it over, wondering. That night, when the hall had quieted and the laughter lay like warm ash in the hearth, Frigg sat with Nanna. The younger woman's fingers threaded through her own, grateful and tired. "We slept last night," Nanna whispered. "No bad dreams. Not one." Frigg smiled. The line between her brows smoothed. "Then we've brought him peace," she said. "That will be enough." She believed it. She had to. Because a mother has to stop somewhere, or she will never stop. And Frigg had gone further than any queen should have to go. Into the heat, into the ice, into caves and forests and the ears of wolves and the quiet centers of spiders. If she had missed anything, surely it would have made itself known. Surely the world, which loved Baldur almost as much as she did, would have tugged her sleeve and said, "Here, this too." But the world is big, and fate is patient, and sometimes the smallest doors stay open because nobody thinks to check them. Frigg kissed Nanna's cheek and rose to go to her own bed. As she passed the window, the moonlight fell on a small arch of green hanging from a beam. Mistletoe. Cut and tied up for luck, for love, for winter games that were months away. She did not even glance at it. How could she have known? For a while, the oaths did exactly what oaths are supposed to do. They wrapped Baldur the way a good cloak wraps a traveller, not to make him proud, but to keep him warm. He walked through the hall without flinching at shadows. He slept without jerking awake with a strangled gasp. He ate, and the taste of food returned. And he laughed in a way that made everyone else laugh too. The gods trusted the good days again. They shouldn't have, maybe. But humans and gods alike are tender toward reprieve. When the pain lets up, you lean into it. That's how we're made. Even Odin, who knows better than anyone that a thing promised is not always a thing delivered, let his shoulders drop a fraction. He stopped watching the ravens as if they might bring him the bad news any minute. He started answering questions before they were finished, as if the future were no longer a sharp stone in his boot. And somewhere in that comfort, the smallest sound went unheard. The sound of a thought. like a seed, rolling into the dark, where it could sprout without hands or sun. Near dawn, Frigg slept. Not the light sleep of a queen with duties in her head, but the heavy, surrendered sleep of a woman who has done all that can be done. She dreamed. Not prophecies, not warnings, but the kind of dream that smells like clean wool and warm bread. She dreamed of Baldr as a little boy, chasing sunlight across the floor. She dreamed of Nanna humming, of the hall full and friendly. If there was a shadow at the edge of it, the kind that makes people turn their pillow and sink back into the quiet, she didn't see it. No one can keep watch forever. Outside, the last star faded. The courtyard waited, innocent as a sheet of new snow. Somewhere, in a corner where people rarely looked, a sprig of mistletoe hung without roots, green as the surprising colour in winter. Small, slight, forgettable, until it wasn't. Chapter 4. The Trickster's Plot. The courtyard of Asgard had become a place of games. Every day the gods gathered there, carrying with them whatever weapon or stone or tool they had to hand, and every day they threw them at Baldr. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? But it wasn't. It was relief. Relief turned into play. Because no matter what they hurled, spear, axe, arrow, hammer, the things turned aside as though the air itself bent away from him. Baldr stood unharmed, smiling, as if wrapped in the world's softest shield. Thor would bellow with laughter. "Try harder," he'd roar, sending an axe tumbling end over end. It would thump harmlessly into the ground. Freya would shake her head, her necklace brissingamen glittering as she laughed. Even beauty can't compare with safety. The younger gods took turns, each delighted, each astonished all over again. And Baldr laughed too, though quietly. Not the laugh of someone who loves games, but the laugh of someone grateful to be alive. Someone who had been living under a shadow and was now standing in the sun again. But not everyone laughed. From the edges of the courtyard, Loki watched. You must understand, Loki was not always hated. He sat at Odin's table. He shared mead with Thor. He travelled on quests that only he had the wit to finish. He was the sly one, yes. The quick tongue, the shapeshifter, the clever hand that found solutions no one else could. But cleverness cuts both ways. A gap is just an answer waiting to be found. And Loki could not bear to leave an answer alone. He leaned against a pillar that day, eyes half-lidded, watching Baldur catch spears as though they were feathers, watching the gods double over with relief. And in him, a thought stirred. Not hate, not yet, but the question that lived always in Loki's mind. Is it really so perfect? Is it really without flaw? That thought sat with him. it whispered, it grew. In the old stories, there are many tellings. Some say Loki guessed at the flaw himself. Some say he went looking. And some, the ones I like best, say he went to Frigg one afternoon, when the games had left the courtyard empty and quiet. Loki changed his shape. He did this often. A bird, a fish, a horse, a woman. This time he chose a harmless figure, an old woman with soft hands and a shawl over her shoulders. No one looks too closely at an old woman in the hall. He found Frigg sitting at her spindle, the thread sliding between her fingers like the slow weaving of fate itself. She smiled at him, or rather, at the old woman she thought he was. "You've worked hard, Lady Frigg," he said, in a voice raspy and kind. "I hear every being in the 9 realms has sworn to do Baldr no harm." Frigg sighed softly, pride and relief in her breath. "Yes, they all swore. Fire, water, stone, steel, beast and bird, sickness and shadow. He is safe." The old woman's eyes crinkled. "All? Every single thing?" Frigg's hands did not pause, but her voice softened. "Almost. Only one I left unbound. A small sprig, growing in the west, high on a tree. Mistletoe. Too young, too soft, too harmless to matter." She smiled faintly. "I could not bring myself to trouble it. It seemed beneath notice." The old woman nodded, made a small sound of agreement. "Harmless," she repeated. "Of course." And then, with no fuss, she left. No one noticed when the old woman slipped away. No one saw her shape ripple, lengthen, sharpen, until it was Loki again. Eyes glinting, smile thin. That evening, he walked alone beyond Asgard's walls, into the quiet groves where trees leaned together like conspirators. There it was, hanging green and innocent from the bough of an oak, mistletoe. Loki reached up. He touched its leaves, cool and pliant beneath his fingers. It smelled faintly of resin, sharp and clean. He broke a branch free. In his hand, the sprig seemed small, laughable even. But Loki's mind did not laugh. He saw what others could not, the space it filled, the gap in the armor, the thread left loose. He shaped the sprig, stripping and sharpening until it was a dart, slim and pointed. Not much to look at, but then many deadly things are not much to look at. When he was finished, he held it up to the fading light. The mistletoe glimmered pale green, almost ghostly. Loki smiled. The next day, the games began again. The guards laughed, tossing spear and axe, enjoying the certainty that nothing could harm Baldr. But at the edge of the courtyard stood Höðr. Baldr's brother, Höðr, was blind. He could not join the games. He stood listening, head tilted to the laughter, the shouts, the thuds of harmless weapons falling aside. His face was calm, but in his calm, there was loneliness. Loki approached him quietly. "Why don't you join them?" he asked. Höðr turned his head toward the voice. "You know why. I cannot see. I cannot aim. I would spoil their fun." Loki's voice was gentle, kind, almost pitying. "But should you not also honor your brother? Should you not also throw as the others do? Why should you be left aside when you love him as they love him?" Höðr's jaw tightened. "I would, if I could." Loki's hand slid into his cloak, drawing out the mistletoe dart. "Then let me help. I will guide your hand. You will not miss." Höðr hesitated. He was no fool. He knew Loki's ways. But Loki's tone was velvet, his words sweet with the taste of justice. "It would mean much to Baldr," he whispered, "to know even his blind brother has joined the game." And so Höðr agreed. Picture it. The gods gathered in the yard, laughter rolling like waves. Weapons flew, clattered, fell harmless at Baldur's feet. He stood tall, smiling, a figure of safety wrapped in light. And at the edge, Loki stood beside Höðr, mistletoe dart in hand. He placed it in Höðr's grip, steadying his arm. "There," Loki murmured. "Aim just so. Now, throw." But the throw, and what follows, that belongs to the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Death of Baldur. The courtyard of Asgard was full of laughter that day. Sunlight struck the gold of the hall, the silver of shields, the polished edges of spears. The air rang with voices and the warm clang of games. Once more, Baldur stood at the center, his shoulders broad, his face serene, the glow of his presence soft as the morning sun. He smiled as spear after spear, axe after axe, stone after stone fell harmlessly around him. Thor roared with delight as his hammer, Mjolnir itself, skimmed Baldur's shoulder without leaving a mark. "Look at him!" Thor bellowed. "Not even thunder can touch him!" The gods cheered. Freya's laughter rang like bells. Freya's necklace glittered as she clapped her hands. Even Odin, usually solemn, allowed a faint curve of his mouth, though his one eye watched more carefully than most noticed. It was a festival of invulnerability, a celebration of safety, and in that joy, no one looked to the edge of the yard, where Loki stood, hand resting lightly on the shoulder of Höðr, Baldur's blind brother. Loki's voice was soft, coaxing, guiding. "Now, brother," he whispered into Höðr's ear, "lift your arm a little higher. Yes, that's it. Aim where the others have. Let Baldur, no, you honor him too. Höðr breathed, steady but uncertain. He could not see the shining figure before him, but he could hear the laughter, feel the warmth of voices urging him on. In his hand, the dart of mistletoe was light, too light. Not the weight of iron or stone. It felt almost like nothing at all. But Loki's hand closed over his, and together they drew back. "Throw," Loki said. Höðr released. The dart flew. It cut through the air with no sound. Not the whistle of an arrow, not the hum of a spear. Just silence, as if the world itself leaned in to watch. It struck Baldur in the chest, and where every other weapon had turned aside, this one did not. The mistletoe pierced him. His smile faltered. His eyes widened, not in pain, but in shock, as though he too could not believe it. And then the shining god fell. The courtyard froze. The laughter died at once, as if smothered. Weapons clattered from hands. Baldur lay upon the ground, pale as the dreams that had haunted him. His light flickered, then dimmed. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the air seemed still. The sun above faltered, a cloud sliding across it. It was Frigg who cried first. A sound that tore from her chest, raw and breaking, echoing across the stones of the courtyard. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside her son. Her hands clutched at his face, his chest, as if she could coax breath back into him. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Nanna, his wife, reached him too, her hands trembling so badly she could scarcely touch him. When she did, her body shook with grief so deep, it broke her heart at once. Later they would say she fell dead from sorrow, lying beside him. Thor's roar shattered the silence. Rage and despair tangled into one. He lifted his hammer, searching wildly for someone to strike. But there was no enemy. Only Höðr, blind and bewildered, standing with empty hands. And Loki, slipping back into the shadows. Odin's one eye closed. He had always known fate could not be denied. But knowing and watching are two different agonies. He felt the weight of the prophecy settle like a stone in his chest. Baldur was dead. And the first note of Ragnarok had been struck. Around them, the gods began to weep. Not quietly, not politely, but as beings who knew the weight of eternity, who knew what it meant to lose one who carried peace among them. Their cries rolled across Asgard like thunder without lightning. The trees bent their branches. The stones of the courtyard wept cold tears of dew. The air itself seemed heavy with sorrow. Even the creatures of Midgard felt it. Farmers paused in their fields, hands trembling on their ploughs, not knowing why tears had sprung to their eyes. Children woke from naps crying, unable to name the grief. Animals lifted their heads, lowing, whimpering, uneasy. The world knew. The world wept. And Loki? He did not stay to see the weeping. Some say he smiled. Some say he looked startled at his own success. But in every telling, he slipped away, quick as shadow, vanishing before Thor's rage could fall upon him. The mistletoe dart lay in the courtyard, pale and green, small enough to be overlooked. But no one overlooked it now. They stared at it as if it were a serpent, coiled, still deadly though it lay lifeless on the stones. They carried Baldur's body to the sea. The ship Hringhorni, the greatest of all vessels, was chosen to bear him. It was so vast it could scarcely be moved to the water, and the gods called upon a giantess to help. Off, upon the deck, they built a great pyre. They laid Baldur upon it, his skin pale as moonlight, his beauty unchanged even in death. Beside him lay Nanna, who had died of grief. They placed their treasures with them: gold, jewels, weapons, tokens of love. Odin leaned upon his spear and looked long at his son. At last, he drew from his own arm a ring, Draupnir, the golden band that dripped 8 more rings of equal weight every 9th night. He laid it upon Baldur's chest, a gift to carry into death. The ship was lit, and flames leapt high. Smoke curled into the sky, dark against the fading sun. The vessel drifted out into the sea, burning, carrying Baldur and Nanna away. The gods stood on the shore, their faces wet with tears, watching until the fire was a distant spark. And, when it was gone, they knew nothing would be the same. For Baldur's death was more than the loss of a beloved son, brother, husband, friend. It was the crack in the wall, the first stone loosened. The sign that the end, Ragnarok, was no longer far off, no longer a rumour in a seer's mouth. Odin's ravens flew restless. Thor paced, fists clenching, unable to strike the grief away. Frigg sat silent, her eyes hollow, her lips moving in prayers that could not undo what had been done. And Baldur's body, though burned upon the pyre, was not gone. It had travelled elsewhere, downward, to the hall of hell. And that is where we will follow next, into the underworld, where Hermóðr the brave will ride to plead for his brother's return. Chapter 6. The Silent Journey. The courtyard was still heavy with smoke from the funeral pyre. The gods stood silent, shoulders bowed, each carrying a grief that could not be put into words. And yet, not all hope was lost. For in the old belief, the dead were not gone. They had simply crossed into another hall, a darker hall, a quieter one. Hell's hall. And some said, if one were brave enough and swift enough, they might yet plead with Hel, the goddess of the underworld, to release Baldur and send him back into the light. The gods turned to Hermóðr. Hermóðr was a son of Odin, though not as famed as Thor, nor as wise as Baldur. But what he carried was courage. A quiet, steadfast courage that asked for nothing in return. When the others hesitated, weighed down by despair, Hermóðr stepped forward. "I will go," he said simply. "I will ride to hell, and I will beg for my brother's return." Odin's gaze rested on him, heavy and knowing. He did not speak for a long moment, and when he did, his voice was low. "Then take my steed. Take Sleipnir." Sleipnir was no ordinary horse. Born of trickery and strange unions, his coat was grey, his eyes dark as storm clouds. But it was his legs that marked him. 8 of them, strong and sure, carrying him faster than any wind, across sea and sky and shadow alike. Odin placed the reins in Hermóðr's hand. "Ride him well. Ride fast. And do not falter." Hermóðr bowed his head, gripping the leather tight. The gods gathered around him, placing their hands upon his shoulders, murmuring prayers, blessings, last hopes. Frigg's eyes shone with tears as she whispered, "Bring him back to me." And then Hermóðr mounted Sleipnir, and without another word, they set out. The road to hell is not a road one can walk in daylight. It stretches downward, outward, across the roots of the world tree Yggdrasil, winding through realms no mortal eyes could bear. Hermóðr rode it, and it took 9 nights. First night, the mountains. The first night, the path led into mountains so tall they scraped the edge of the stars. The air was thin, sharp, tasting of stone and ice. Wolves howled far off, their voices echoing through the valleys. Sleipnir's hooves struck sparks against the rock, but the horse did not stumble, his 8 legs carrying them swift as shadow. Hermóðr wrapped his cloak tighter around him, eyes fixed ahead. Behind him, Asgard was already far, the light of its halls fading to memory. Ahead was only silence. Second night, the forest. The second night, the road passed into a forest so thick that moonlight barely touched the ground. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted, their branches hanging low like arms that wished to catch the rider. Owls blinked from the dark. Shapes moved between the trees, following without sound. Hermóðr kept his hand on the reins, steady, trusting Sleipnir's steps. The forest seemed endless, and yet by dawn's first grey light, they had passed through. Third night, the mists. The third night, the mists rose, cold, clinging, thick enough to choke. They swallowed the path, the stars, even the sound of hooves. Hermóðr could see nothing, not even Sleipnir's head before him. But the horse did not falter. His breath steamed, his body solid and certain beneath Hermóðr's hands. The rider whispered into the fog, as if to steady himself. For Baldr. For Baldr. The mist thinned only when the dawn came again, pale and weak. Fourth night, the river. The fourth night, they reached a river, wide and dark, its waters rushing with the sound of 1,000 whispers. Faces seemed to stir beneath the surface, pale eyes opening and closing in the current. There was no bridge here, only stones slick with moss. Sleipnir stepped carefully, his 8 legs moving with uncanny balance. Hermóðr clung to his mane, heart pounding as the water foamed around them, whispering, but they crossed, and the river fell behind. Fifth night, the plain of shadows. The fifth night stretched across a plain where nothing grew. The ground was dry, cracked, silent. The sky above was endless black, not even stars to soften it. Here, Hermóðr felt the weight of despair pressing down. His thoughts whispered, "Turn back. Baldr is gone. No one returns from hell." But he gritted his teeth, leaned forward, and whispered again into Sleipnir's ear. "For Baldr. For Baldr." And the horse ran on. Sixth night, the storm. The sixth night brought a storm. Wind tore at them, rain lashed down like needles. Thunder rolled, lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Hermóðr bent low over Sleipnir's neck, eye stinging, his cloak heavy with water. But Sleipnir galloped steady, hooves striking the ground like drumbeats, outpacing the storm itself. By dawn, they were wet, weary, but alive. Seventh night, the bridge of Gjöll. The seventh night, they reached the river Gjöll. Its waters ran cold and bright, clearer than glass, but beneath its surface swam the shadows of the dead. Across it stretched a bridge, arched high, roofed with gold so bright it gleamed even in the dimness of that realm. And there stood the maiden Morthgud, guardian of the bridge. Her face was pale, her hair long and dark, her eyes sharp as frost. She barred their way with her spear. "Who goes there?" she demanded, her voice echoing like stone. Hermóðr straightened in the saddle. "Hermóðr, son of Odin. I ride to Hel to beg for my brother Baldur." Morthgud studied him long. "Yesterday," she said at last, "a host of dead passed over this bridge. So many, the boards shook beneath their feet. They travelled west, to Hel's hall. If you are swift, you may yet catch them." She lowered her spear, and Sleipnir stepped past, hooves ringing upon the golden roof. Eighth night, the gate. The eighth night brought them to a high wall, black and cold, surrounding a great hall. At its gate, Sleipnir leapt, not once, but thrice, soaring higher each time until at last he cleared the barrier. Hermóðr clung tight, his heart pounding, and when they landed within, he looked up at the hall before him. It was vast, silent. Its roof shone with fearsome shapes. Its doors stood closed, heavy as fate itself. Ninth night. The Hall of Hell. On the 9th night, Hermóðr dismounted. He stroked Sleipnir's neck, whispered his thanks. Then he walked forward alone, to stand before the doors of Hell's hall. They were cold beneath his hands. The air smelled of stone and stillness. Beyond lay Baldur, and the goddess who now held him. Hermóðr drew a breath, heavy, steady, and pushed the doors wide. And that is where we leave him in this chapter, standing at the threshold of Hell's hall, about to plead for his brother's return. Chapter 7. The Hall of Hell. The doors of Hell's hall groaned as Hermóðr pushed them open. The sound echoed, long and hollow, like the tolling of a bell across an empty field. Inside, the air was colder than any mountain night. It was the cold of places where no fire burns, where no breath stirs the air. The cold of endings. Hermóðr stepped forward. Sleipnir's hooves clicked softly behind him, each step careful on the stone floor. The hall stretched wide, its roof high and shadowed. Pillars rose like frozen trees, black and unyielding. The walls were carved with runes that glimmered faintly, as though written in frost that never melted. Along the sides of the hall sat the dead, countless figures, pale and quiet, their eyes downcast. Some still bore the marks of how they had died: wounds, sickness, weariness. Yet all sat in silence, waiting. At the far end of the hall rose a high seat. Upon it sat Hel. She was half and half, not in the way of mixtures, but as they two truths had been pressed together and left to stand side by side. One half of her face was that of a woman, pale, solemn, with hair dark as raven's wings. Her eyes there was sharp, watching, filled with strange calm. The other half was the colour of ash and bone, a face of death itself, skin tight against skull, empty eye, lips darkened. Her dress was black and white. Her hall was named Eljudnir, her plate hunger, her knife famine. Around her prowled hounds with eyes like embers buried in ash. And yet, she did not sneer. She did not rage. She regarded Hermóðr as a queen regards a supplicant, steady, cool, curious. Hermóðr walked forward, his footsteps echoing. He bowed his head. "Lady Hel," he said, his voice steady though his heart shook. "I come to beg for my brother, Baldur, the shining god. Release him, I pray. He is loved by all, by gods, by men, by every creature of the world. Let him come back with me into the light." Hel's gaze did not waver. She leaned upon the arm of her throne, one pale hand against her cheek. "Loved by all?" she asked softly. Her voice was strange, half warm, half hollow, as though spoken by two mouths at once. "All things weep for him." Yes, Hermóðr said. The world weeps. The stones weep. The rivers weep. Even the gods cannot bear his absence. Return him, and let his light shine again. Hel lifted her hand, and Hermóðr turned. And there, among the dead, sat Baldur. He was pale, yes, but his beauty had not faded. His hair still gleamed, his face still shone with calm. Yet his eyes, they were quiet, dim, as though a veil had been drawn across them. At his side sat Nanna, his beloved, who had died of grief. She reached out to him, and Baldur's hand rested lightly in hers. Around them lay treasures. Draupnir, the golden ring Odin had placed upon his chest, and the gifts the gods had sent with him into death. When Baldur saw Hermóðr, a faint smile touched his lips. He rose, walking to meet his brother. "Brother," he said, his voice soft, echoing strangely in the hall. "You came." Hermóðr's chest ached at the sight of him. He reached out, clasped Baldur's hand, holding it tight. "I came to bring you home," Hermóðr whispered. Hel watched them, silent for a long time. Her hounds lay their heads upon their paws, their ember eyes unblinking. At last, she spoke. "If it is true," she said, "that Baldur is loved by all, then let all things weep for him. Let every creature, every stone, every root, every flame, every river, let all weep. If they do, I will release him. He may return to Asgard, to his hall, to his mother's arms." Her voice dropped, colder. "But if there is one, only one, who does not weep, then he will remain here, in Hel, until the world ends." The hall was silent. The dead did not stir. Hermóðr's breath shook, but he bowed low. "Then I will carry your words back," he said. Before he left, Baldr pressed a gift into his hand. Draupnir, the golden ring to return to Odin. Nenna too sent gifts. A cloth for Frigg, a ring for Fulla. Hermóðr held his brother close, though his arms felt like they wrapped around mist. "I will come back for you," he swore. "The world will weep, and you will walk in the light again." Baldr only smiled faintly, as if he knew something more. As if he had already glimpsed the threads of fate, woven tighter than any vow. Hermóðr mounted Sleipnir once more. The doors of Hel's hall swung open, cold air rushing out like a sigh. And with the goddess's words burning in his mind, he began the long ride back upward, back toward Asgard. Behind him, Baldr stood among the dead, still shining, but trapped in the stillness of Hel's realm. And that is where we will leave him now. Hermóðr carries hope in his heart, and Hel's bargain in his hand. The gods will weep. The world will weep. And yet, as in all these old stories, fate waits quietly at the edge. Chapter 8. The Weeping of the World. Hermóðr returned to Asgard on Sleipnir's swift legs. The gods gathered at the gates before he had even dismounted, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding with hope. He told them everything, how Hel had spoken, calm and steady, her voice half warm, half cold. How Baldur had sat among the dead, pale but still shining. How Nanna had sent her gifts, tokens of love to her sisters and to Frigg. And most of all, the bargain. If all things weep for him, Hermóðr said, every being in every realm, then Hel will release Baldur. He will come home. A murmur ran through the gods, shock, relief, a stirring of joy. It could be done. Surely it could be done. For who, in all the 9 realms, would not weep the Baldur? So they sent their messengers, riders, walkers, ravens, winds. They carried the plea across the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, through fire and frost, across mountains and seas. And everywhere they went, they spoke the same words. Baldur is dead. Weep for him. Weep, and he will be returned. And everywhere, the world answered. They went first to the stones, hard, ancient, silent as they are. The messengers laid their hands upon granite cliffs, upon river boulders, upon pebbles in the fields. Will you weep? They asked. Will you mourn for Baldur? And the stones cracked softly, as if sighing. Tears of moisture seeped through their faces, glistening like dew. Cliffs echoed with the sound of sorrow, deep and hollow. Even the smallest pebble grew damp, its silence heavy with grief. The earth itself wept. The messengers went into forests, where trees stood with their roots tangled deep in soil. Will you weep? They asked, and the oaks bent their branches, leaves trembling. Birches let fall their silver bark like shedding skin. Pines whispered long and low, their resin dripping like tears. Ash and elm creaked, sorrow in every groan of their trunks. Even Yggdrasil itself shivered, the great world tree letting its leaves fall like drops of grief upon the realms. The forests wept. They turned to rivers, streams, and seas. Will you weep? They asked. And the rivers foamed white, overflowing their banks with sorrow. Streams ran cloudy, carrying their mourning down into valleys. Waterfalls thundered louder than before, crashing like sobs against stone. The great ocean surged, waves lifting and falling, a sound like the deepest lament. Every drop of water seemed to grieve. Even the rain wept harder, falling with a steady patter as though the sky itself mourned. The waters wept. The messengers sought out the beasts. Will you weep? The deer lifted their heads, tears glimmering in their soft eyes. Wolves tilted back their heads and howled, long and low, a song of mourning. Bears rumbled deep, sorrow in their chests. Foxes slunk quietly, eyes downcast. Cattle in the fields lowed in grief, sheep pressed close together. Horses stamped and snorted, restless with sorrow. And the birds? The eagles screamed high above the mountains. Owls hooted in mournful tones. Ravens croaked with heavy voices, circling slower than before. Even the smallest sparrows drooped their wings, their songs turning into sighs. The beasts and birds wept. Even the smallest lives were asked, "Will you weep?" Snakes hissed softly, their eyes gleaming wet in the dim. Spiders let fall strands of silk that trembled like threads of sorrow. Beetles paused in their endless scuttling, antennae bowed. Worms shifted in the soil, the earth damp with their grief. All that crept and crawled gave their tears. The messengers spoke to fire. "Will you weep?" Flames flickered low, their crackle softer, sparks dimming into gentle embers. Even fire bowed, promising not to burn, but to mourn. They spoke to the wind. "Will you weep?" The wind sighed through valleys, carrying the sound of mourning across miles. It whistled low and sad through cracks in the mountains, a song of grief no one could mistake. Even storm winds paused, falling still for a moment, as though bowing their heads. The fire and the wind wept, and so it was. In Muspelheim, the flames wept. In Niflheim, the ice cracked with sorrow. In Alfheim, the light grew dim, the elves bowing their heads. In Svartalfheim, the dwarves laid down their tools, tears streaking their soot-black faces. In Jotunheim, even giants rumbled with grief, their mountain voices heavy. In Midgard, humans wept openly, mothers, children, warriors, kings. Every realm gave its tears. Every creature bowed. Every Thin mourned Baldr. The messengers returned, their voices raised, their hearts lightening. "All things have wept," they cried. "Every stone, every tree, every beast and bird, every fire, every river. The whole world mourns Baldr." Hope swept Asgard like spring. Frigg lifted her face, joy trembling in her eyes. Thor clapped his brother's shoulder, fierce in relief. Even Odin, grim Odin, let out a long breath, his one eye brightening. It was true. Surely it was true. Baldr would return. But in all these stories, there is always one shadow at the edge. One figure who turns away when all others bow. And that shadow was waiting. Chapter 9. The Refusal. The messengers returned to Asgard. Their voices rang out in the halls, full of triumph, full of hope. "All things have wept," they said. "Every stone, every tree, every beast and bird, even fire and frost, even rivers and oceans, all the realms have mourned for Baldur. He will be released. He will come home, Frigg's heart soared. She pressed her hands to her face, tears of joy slipping between her fingers. Thor lifted his hammer high in celebration. Freya's golden necklace caught the light as she laughed through her tears. Even Odin, who had seen too much to rejoice easily, let out a long, shuddering breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe. It seemed as if the world had been mended. But there was one more. The messengers, thorough and dutiful, had left no being unasked. They had travelled every road, every forest, every cave, and at last they came to a dark place, far from the warmth of Asgard. A cave in the side of a lonely mountain. There sat a giantess. Her name was Turk, they say. She was old, bent, her face shadowed. Some say she was no giantess at all, but Loki himself in another shape. The messengers bowed and spoke the same words they had spoken everywhere else. Baldr is dead. Weep for him, as all others have wept. Weep, and he will be returned to us. Tuck lifted her head. Her eyes glinted, sharp as stones under ice. "I see no need," she said. "My eyes are dry. My heart is still. Why should I weep for Baldr? Let hell keep what she holds." Her voice was flat, without warmth, without sorrow. The messengers pleaded. They begged her to reconsider. "If you do not weep, all is lost. The whole world has mourned him. One tear from you is all that is needed. Just one." But Turk shook her head, slow and certain. "I owe him nothing. Dead or alive, it matters little to me. I will not weep." And with those words, the chain of weeping broke. The messengers returned, heavy with dread. When they entered the hall, their faces were pale, their voices low. They told the gods what had happened, that one being, only one, had refused, that her dry eyes outweighed all the tears of the world. Frigg fell to her knees, her sobs tearing through the hall. "Who could be so cold?" she cried. "Who could deny him when every stone and stream and bird gave their grief?" Thor's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. He roared, his fury shaking the walls. "Bring her to me. I'll make her weep." But Odin's voice stopped him. No, the All-Father's face was carved from sorrow. "It is done. Fate has spoken. The bargain was clear. One refusal is enough." And so Baldr's doom was sealed. Whispers began. Was Turk truly a giantess? Or had Loki, sly and cruel, taken another shape to twist the bargain? Some swore they had seen Loki's glint in her eyes, heard his slyness in her flat tone. Others said no, it was simply the way of fate. That even among the countless beings of the world, there must always be one who stands apart, one who breaks the circle. Either way, it did not matter. Whether it was Loki or Turk, the result was the same. Baldur would not return. The news struck Asgard like a second death. The gods who had dared to hope now bowed their heads in despair. Frigg sat in silence, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling in her lap. She had begged the world, and the world had answered. Almost. Almost. But almost was not enough. Thor paced like a caged storm, hammer in hand, unable to strike against fate itself. Freya wept openly, her tears glittering as they fell. Tyr clenched his fist, his jaw tight. But no courage could fight this battle. And Odin turned his gaze inward, past the hall, past the realms, to the vision of what lay ahead. He saw Ragnarok more clearly than ever. The death of Baldr was its herald, the first stone cast into the river of the end. He closed his eye, and his heart grew heavier than iron. And so it was. The world had wept, but one had not. And because of that one dry face, that one still heart, Baldr would remain in Hel's hall. There, among the dead, he would sit, pale but shining, until the end of days. And that was the moment hope broke. All the tears of the world could not outweigh one refusal. And in that truth, the gods learned how sharp and unyielding fate could be. Chapter 10. The Quiet Aftermath. When the messenger's words had finished echoing through the hall, silence fell. Not the silence of peace, nor the silence of rest, but the silence that comes after a blow, when the world itself is too stunned to move. The gods sat in that silence, shoulders bowed, eyes hollow. Baldur was not returning. The weeping had failed. Fate had closed its hand. Frigg sat alone in her chamber. Her spindle lay untouched, thread loose in her lap. She did not weave, for what thread could bind a sun back into life? Her eyes stared into the fire, but she did not see its flames. She saw instead Baldur as a child, laughing in the meadow, chasing sunlight across the hall's golden floor. She saw his smile, his kindness, his light. Her hands trembled as she lifted the gifts Nanna had sent from Hel. The cloth, soft and fine. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the scent of sorrow, and wept until her tears soaked the weave. The Queen of Asgard, the one who had begged every being in the world, now sat powerless, and her grief was deeper than oceans. Odin stood apart, one hand on his spear, the other stroking the feathers of his ravens. His one eye looked far, far beyond the walls of Asgard. He saw Baldur in Hel's hall, sitting pale among the dead. He saw the threads of fate tighten, a great net pulling toward Ragnarok. He saw fire rising, ships of the dead sailing, wolves unchained, the world tree shuddering. And though his face was stern, Inside him, the sorrow was heavy. Baldr was not just his son. He was the promise of gentleness, of peace, of light. And that promise was gone. Odin said little, but the weight in his silence pressed on every god. Thor could not sit still. He paced the hall like a storm caged in stone. His hammer hung at his side, his fists clenching and unclenching. He wanted someone to strike, someone to punish, someone to hurl into the abyss. But there was no foe he could reach. Only fate. Only the unyielding finality of Hell's word. So he raged in silence, his breath heavy, his eyes bright with tears he would not shed in the open. And Loki, he had already slipped away, gone from the halls before Thor's hammer could find him, before Odin's gaze could pierce his disguise. Some said he laughed as he went, thin and sharp, echoing like a knife scraping stone. Others said he fled in fear, knowing the gods would one day call him to account. But whether in triumph or in terror, Loki was gone, and the shadow of his deed stretched long over Asgard. In the days that followed, Asgard grew quiet. The feasts ended early. The benches sat half empty. The fire burned, but no one sang. Even the clang of weapons on the training field was softer, dulled by sorrow. The gods still walked their halls, but slower. Their laughter was gone. Their joy was dimmed. It was as if Baldur's light had been the sun above them all. And now it had set, leaving only twilight. And in that twilight, the gods began to hear the whispers. Ragnarok. The end of all things. They had known it was coming, for the seers had spoken it, for Odin had sacrificed to learn it. But knowing is one thing. Seeing its first shadow fall is another. The death of Baldr was that shadow. It was the crack in the wall, the sound of the first stone sliding loose before an avalanche. And the gods knew. Nothing they did now could stop what was coming. In Midgard, the mortals felt it too. Nights seemed longer. Winters seemed harsher. A heaviness hung in the air, though few could name it. They told each other stories of Baldr, how he had once walked among them, how he had brought gentle dreams, and they whispered that one day, when the world ended and was remade, he would return. But for now, there was only silence. The silence of grief. The silence of waiting. And yet, they remembered him. They remembered Baldur's smile, his calm voice, his light that softened even Odin's gaze. They remembered how safe he made them feel, how joy seemed easier in his presence. And they carried that memory, tender and painful, like a flame cupped in their hands. It was all they had left of him. And so the halls of Asgard grew quiet. The shining god lay in Hel's hall, waiting. The gods sat in grief, their eyes turned toward the shadow of the end. But you are safe here. You can rest. Breathe in. Breathe out. The story has been told. And though fate in the old tales could not be changed, we who listen can still carry Baldur's light in our dreams. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. Let the sorrow drift away like mist. Sweet dreams. Sleep well. And thank you for listening.